So we'll request Ambassador Sujan Chinoy to give us his perspective.
Namaskar. Thank you very much, Arvind, for this invitation to come and speak to you and to your membership here at large. It's very difficult to add anything after the very perceptive remarks made by the Sherpa and by Mr. Srinivas, as also Secretary Pardesi. But let me tell you that as the Think 20 chair for India, I have an immediate solution to your Bajra problem. I'm from Kathiawad, from Saurashtra, and I grew up eating millets for my evening meal. And we have Bajrana Rotla, and I shall be happy to actually give you the recipe. We also make biscuits out of Bajra. So good is that millet. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to be here as the Think 20 chair and perhaps also as DG MP-IDSA. But let me also very candidly state that I have no monopoly on thinking or basically providing any immediate solutions to the challenges that the G20 faces. But one thing strikes me straight away that I recall originally as ambassador to Japan that we were to be the G20 president in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And it was also part of my sort of duty to convince the Japanese to swap with us. And I think they later swapped with someone else. But it augurs well that we are doing it in 2023. And why do I say this? I say this because of the obvious facts that India has now been long enough in the G20 to provide continuity in no less than a person than the Prime Minister of India. I would imagine he's the most experienced leader to figure in any G20 conference today. And the team with him is also much the same. Over the last nearly 9 years, a very large number of people have contributed to India's rise. It augurs well that we are doing it in 2023 when India has become the 5th largest economy in the world and has overtaken the United Kingdom. It augurs well that we do it now when we have emerged as a resilient economy post the challenges of the pandemic. It augurs well that we have already shown the world a path into the future, one that puts society and the principles of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam before our own selves, service before self. And we have proved it to the world as we emerged from the challenges of the pandemic. That being said, let me also say that India's G20 presidency coincides with a number of very fortuitous developments around us. The biggest one is that the G7 presidency is being held by a very close strategic partner of India, that is Japan. And I have also had multiple meetings as the T20 chair with the T7 chair, who happens to be also the dean and the CEO of the Asian Development Bank Initiative. It is further fortuitous that the quadrilateral security dialogue is being led this year, is being hosted this year by yet another strategic partner, that is Australia. And as we look at firming up our Act East policy, we see that it is Indonesia that is, in fact, chairing the ASEAN. So when we look around us, I think the circumstances are most favorable to our chairing the G20 at the end of a period that has been extremely disruptive. For multiple reasons, we have seen that the major vectors that have given us globalization are all greatly challenged today, beginning with trade, technology, capital and investments, as well as the movement of people. And yet, there is hope that the world can do better tomorrow. And it is in this space that India brings hope and expectation to the G20. The G20 is extremely important in my view, because when we look at a fractured world, when we look at the number of salons at the global level that are available for a discourse, for some kind of consensus building, the G20 appears to be the most representative. For if we look at the East Asia Summit process, which is yet another large grouping of 18 countries, including the 10 ASEAN plus the 6 dialogue partners, plus the contending major powers like the United States of America and the Russian Federation, it still falls short of the fact that the G20 has 19 large economies plus the EU, plus a number of other invitees that we hope to include. As we cast our net wide and far, we hope to also bring in the views, the voices of the global south. But in doing so, we cannot ignore the voice of the established major economies. And I think India will have to use its diplomatic skills to ensure that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. In our G20 presidency, we will have to, in fact, build consensus across the board. We are looking, ladies and gentlemen, at a world which is greatly distressed today along 6 major factors. They're all beginning with the letter T. I would describe them as trade, first and foremost, which has been the subject of a great deal of securitization, if I may call it, or also perhaps the weaponization of trade that we have seen beginning with the friction between the United States and China. But we have also seen how this has also escalated into technology, the second T. And going beyond that, we have seen that the T of territory or territorial differences in our part of the world, in Europe as well, are the major cause of disruption today. Then we have the T of terrorism, which hardly comes up when we discuss the G20, but without there being stability, without there being peace and stability in societies, which is bereft of terrorism or that omnipotent threat of terrorism, there can be no progress. So that T of terrorism is also very important. And then comes the 5th T of the tenets, as in narratives, as in the discourse about systems of governance, whether social, economic, cultural, political. And the world is awash today with alternatives, with choices. Choices are good. But when choices are also presented through propaganda to distressed countries, to countries that are suffering the consequences of disruptions of supply chains, then there is need to stop, pause, and think about the superiority of certain systems and the extraordinary damage that certain other systems can do to the mindset of the global community. And the last but not the least is also the T of trust, or the absolute lack of it today. So India is entering the presidency, the G20, with multiple challenges facing it. And I think it is very important to also look at certain specifics. And I do so, mind you, not as an expert. There are experts at this table. The Sherpa is an expert. But my job is also to ask a few questions as the Think 20 chair. And let me begin by firstly mentioning that at the macroeconomic level, the one thing that strikes me is that trade is very fungible. And though much is made of this friction in trade, trade is not something that lends itself easily to securitization, because trade is something that is led by the private sector. It is led by entrepreneurs in industry who follow the profit principle. They know better than bureaucrats sitting in different, salons of government buildings. Very difficult to control. And that is one of the reasons why at a time when we look at the injury caused to global supply chains, for instance, by the disruptive rise of China's economy and the kind of gaming that certain economies have engaged in the WTO process or in the liberal trading order, we still find that our trade with China has dramatically increased since Galwan. It is now at $135 billion. And we are not the only ones. The United States of America, Japan, Australia, all of them have seen all of them have seen their trade rise. And one of the reasons is that, ladies and gentlemen, trade cannot be controlled so easily. So what is it that can be controlled in this space that is increasingly being securitized today? The developmental stories of the world today are being hijacked by security issues. And it is in the field of technology and mutual investments that you find that the greatest impact of this securitization can be felt. And it is quite successful, as we've seen in the case of the United States, through export controls, through sanctions, having succeeded in engaging China and others through certain denial regimes. But more than that, we have to also see if it is possible today to work together to build a new kind of consensus. This word consensus in the G20 is very important. For the G20 can only make recommendations. It is not the UN Security Council. And so how do you build consensus when there are such fissures and fractures within the G20? Everybody is represented there, but not everybody is on the same page. You have the G7 there, you have the BRICS there, you have the United States of America there, you also have Russian Federation there, you have a China there, you have certain other countries that are part of the US security umbrella but do not necessarily vote with the United States when it comes to certain other key issues. Examples being countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, for instance. So this is a very complex world, and I think when India looks for that denominator, it must not look for the most common denominator. That will be the dilution of everything that we seek to achieve. We must try and see if it's possible to work in tandem with partners within the G20. We must not look for the most diluted common denominator. We must seek to protect certain key themes, low-hanging fruit, and see if we can do something more on the bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, as in plurilateral level, to take certain themes to their logical conclusion, with or without others in the room. And this is, I think, one of the key outcomes of this G20, which India must protect at all cost. I must also now go into a few specific suggestions, with your permission. As far as the digital future is concerned, I think one of the key possibilities for this G20 is for India's successful application of, for instance, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile JAM platform, and the kind of UPI platform that we have used within the country to be offered to developing countries. As we speak for the Global South, it is possible to perhaps do this. Our Rupee Pay is also being expanded around the world, the latest being Singapore, I'm told. We must therefore look at this possibility and to give it in a pro bono manner as part of our contribution to capacity building in developing countries. We must offer it. And I'm quite certain that the bigger powers that are also looking to ramping up their relations with Africa, for instance, and I would count in this countries, well-meaning countries like Japan, others who have an eye to a strategic presence in Africa, such as the United States of America, they will work with us if we offer it in a sufficiently impactful manner. One of the most important themes for the G20 will be lifestyle for the environment, which is to be seen in consonance with resilience and values for well-being. And I know, Madam, that you've been contributing on this score to one of our task forces. Life, in fact, proposed by the Prime Minister of India at COP26 is one of the most important themes for me at this G20. And it's a way to achieve the vision for living in harmony with nature, which was, as you know, the objective of the Global Diversity Conference, which was held in December last. So one of the easiest ways to achieve the recommendations of the Global Diversity Conference is, in fact, Prime Minister Modi's Lifestyle for Environment proposal. It is the only way to create pro-planet people. And of course, there are doubts being expressed in several quarters already that it is anathema, it is the antithesis, some might say, of growth. But that's not true. I think growth has to come with a certain degree of responsibility and accountability as we look at depleting resources around the world today. For unbridled growth only leaves the world divided with regard to the challenge of growth. It is for good reason that we see today that there is a part of the world that has grown through the Industrial Revolution without any thought for the consequences on the environment, and there is a vast, number of people on this planet who have not yet had that opportunity to grow. And as they seek to grow, I think it is gratuitous to expect them to pay for their own growth when the developed world has not had a care during their period of growth. So this brings in the question of financing, what you call equitable financing for a greener future. And the developed world will have to pay unless they want to contend with the reality that the developing world may not be able to bring about the changes that are being demanded of them. Some may be able to do it in a voluntary fashion, like India has already committed itself to the Panchamrit, to the whole notion of net zero by 2070. But there aren't many countries in the world that can do that without help. And therefore, finance for green energy is very important. India is a large enough economy to do it, perhaps on its own. And we have already committed $2.4 billion, as you know, 20,000 crores to our national green hydrogen mission. The world also needs a very heavy dose, not just of our vaccine Maitri, but also a Maitri which teaches them the importance of values and ethics. The entire world today needs a new moral compass when it comes to growth, when it comes to this whole notion of finance, climate change, etc. And there is no other country in the world that is better placed than India to give that kind of thing. Making available, therefore, finance through the multilateral development banks is also very important. The international financial institutions. Now we have seen how the IMF and the World Bank they are basically treaty organizations that came about as a result of the Second World War, the establishment of the United Nations. But their functioning is rather archaic. I know that Mr. Srinivas is the expert, but I do want to pose this question: that for how long will the IMF work on the basis of quotas, for instance, which have no bearing on current economic stature or contribution to the global economy? I know that a number of changes have been made. In 2008, for instance, the basic voting rights were increased from 250 for each member to 750. And yet we see that today, India, which in fact contributes to about 3.5% of global GDP, has a quota share which is well below 3%. A United Kingdom that has already been overtaken by India has a quota share of 6.4% or so, when its contribution to the global economy is about 4.4%. Is this an egalitarian world? Are we looking only at incremental increases in quotas, or are we going to do something about it? What about the fact that there is a surcharge being levied today by the IMF to the tune of $4 billion on the very distressed economies that are suffering the consequences of the pandemic or the war in Ukraine? 75 or more of these economies today have to pay an IMF surcharge of $4 billion. And that, I think, is extraordinary. So I think some thought needs to be given to how we look at special drawing rights of the IMF. Similarly, the World Bank. These are institutions that still continue to be led by the privileged few. The same people who set up the United Nations Security Council and established veto power, they continue to also wield the same veto power in the World Bank and the IMF. It's time for us to look at changes that are more fundamental in nature, especially in the global financial institutions. As far as the SDGs are concerned, I think of the 17 SDGs, in my view, the most important today is food security. Whether it is millets or anything else, The point is that India can make a major difference here. We are one of the world's largest producers of wheat. We have demonstrated our capacity to provide, again in a pro bono manner, wheat to not just Afghanistan, but also countries like Egypt, where we have recently given 61,000 tons of wheat as part of our outlook towards a vision towards a world that is free from hunger. And millets, we produce about 41% of all the millets in the world. If only we can give them the bajra ka rotla recipes, we'll get the world to appreciate the importance of millets. So I think we should look at that very closely. Let me end by making one large point on reform of multilateral institutions such as the United Nations. I'm struck by the fact that, for nearly 100 years, the world has been grappling with something that can provide peace and stability by way of a global structure, beginning with the Treaty of Versailles, which very quickly ran into the ground in 1919. Nothing much came out of it. And the League of Nations set up in 1920, beg your pardon, did not even have the support of the United States of America. It was destined to be dead on arrival. 2 years later, in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty had failed. The UK and Germany were still unable to agree on how many dreadnoughts they should produce to threaten each other on the high seas. And the United States took no interest in the League of Nations, and yet it existed for a while. It existed until Japan, after the invasion of Manchuria, left in 1933, or Germany left in 1936 after interfering in the Spanish War, or that Italy left after invading Abyssinia, or that the Soviet Union was actually thrown out in 1939 after having remained in the League of Nations for 5 years, from 1934 to 1939. And the League of Nations died its own death on the 19th of April, 1946, a year or so after less than a year after the United Nations was set up as an alternative structure. It sank without a trace. But the structure that came in its place is also far from being perfect. We have seen that it has brooked no change. The UN Security Council especially has brooked no change since the 1960s. The last time anyone tinkered with that system or allowed it to be reformed was between 1961 and 1965, when the ECOSOC discussed this and debated this, finally coming up with a resolution in 1965, which allowed the non-permanent category to expand from 6 to 10. And the entire membership went up from 11 to 15. A structure that was meant to service or to at least reflect the situation as it emerged from the end of the Great War, based on the founding principle of to the victor go all spoils. That is a structure that is still thrust upon us in the 21st century, with total indifference to the rebalancing in global power that has since taken place. There were only 51 members when the UN was set up in 1945. Today, there are 193 members, and yet there has been no change to the UN Security Council. So when we look around us, ladies and gentlemen, we see a world which has failed to keep pace with the realities and the rapid changes that are taking place in terms of the shift of global engines of economic growth to our parts, and not just to one little part of Asia, that is East Asia. Growth, prosperity, development, these great aspirations to which all of us have a right are also increasingly within grasp, and they are available to all of us in a much broader region, which should seek to unite us in a very purposeful manner. And that is also the Indo-Pacific. For the Indo-Pacific is much more contemporary, much more democratic, much more reflective of the current reordering and the balance of power that is changing in favor of our part of the world. And in this, matrix, I see that India's rise is unstoppable, that India will emerge as one of the strongest economies and also a Vishwa Guru, a Vishwa Vaidya, to lead this world into a better future. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, for that very powerful speech that you have given, arguing for a change in the world order and the need of the rest of the world to be heard in these councils, and whether G20 can live up to that expectation is a big question mark.